The 10 Kings Time Script, Part 3. My name is Daniel Valles, and welcome to our channel. Historic time frame. Let's look at a wide view of history, some of the events that have been leading up to where we are now, the prophetic events that Scripture also tells us we should expect to see will happen and will lead up to the beginning and the ending of the events that are prophesied. We are here in April 2023. When we look at the past 400 years, it is amazing how much has changed in just the past 100 years. Within this generation, within this time frame of people who are still alive today, there are a handful of people in the world right now that are around 115 years old, which really is amazing when you consider how much they have seen in history, how much the world has changed. And because Jesus Christ told us that the last generation will see all these events, including the events at the beginning and the replanting of Israel, that does also include the period prior to 1948 too. Some significant geopolitical events with the earthquakes and wars and rumors of wars. All that is a very important part of prophecy because there are events going on that will lead to and are still continuing the changes in our world that will lead to the arrival of the Antichrist. And so over the past 400 years, some of the things that have changed is the Ottoman Empire came to an end. And it went from about 1299 to 1922. That's when it came to its formal end. There is also the Holy Roman Empire, which went from the early Middle Ages to 1806. So about 200 years ago, and that's considered the First Reich, the First Empire, the Holy Roman Empire. And we know it had a close affiliation, a very public affiliation with the Vatican. The Pope was the one who crowned a lot of the emperors in the Holy Roman Empire. Definite connection there. We also know with the Vatican that they had the Templars. They were a Vatican military order, but they were also considered the first bankers, which gave them a lot of power and influence because they started dealing with a lot of money, particularly as they banked and stored the money of those who went on the Crusades. And they also apparently are the ones who invented the idea of checks, holding other people's deposits on money instead of carrying all that gold and silver, just carrying a check for it all. And of course they ran into their scandals and were eventually dispersed into other orders of the Vatican and of the Catholic Church, the Hospitallers and others. So the power and influence really went underground. It disappeared, but it went into other areas. The power and influence was just shifted around. It was still there. Of course, around 1611, that's when the King James Version was translated, and the Pilgrims were in 1620. The Pilgrim prophecy, how Christ said there will be another nation that will bring forth fruit for him for a time. That is part of prophecy. And it alludes to that same passage in the Old Testament that alludes to how in the end days there will be the children of darkness who make a covenant with death and hell, who think that they're going to get through some of the things that are coming, but they won't. And so it is amazing, the more that we look at history, see it as a fulfillment of prophecy. And the more that we study and gird ourselves with truth, the armor of truth, we can start to see, particularly as we hold fast the Scripture, see God's hand at work down through time and prophecy. And that is what history is. It is watching prophecy being fulfilled. Now we know around 1648, that is when the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II gave the Jews of Prague permission to fly a Jewish flag. Over their synagogue, this Jewish flag was red with a yellow Star of David at its center. So here, about only 30 years after the Pilgrims, this symbol and this color is also starting to be associated with the Jews publicly, visibly, even though up until that point it wasn't a Jewish symbol, but it was associated because it's a mystical symbol. It symbolizes, and it's used in the occult. It's starting to become visibly for the public associated with the Jewish people. In 1694, the Bank of England. In 1770, that's when the Grand Lodge of English Freemasons was formed there in London. London is starting to become a significant center. In 1776, that is the Bavarian Illuminati was founded. Of course, 1776, we know that is also the same time that America, as we know it, the United States of America, got underway. That government of the land where the Pilgrims were residing, they are strangers and pilgrims in a land that is now the United States of America. And now in 2023, that marks 246 years of the United States of America, which obviously was formed with a lot of Freemason influences, and that was reflected in a lot of the buildings, in especially Washington, D.C. after that. We also have passed 400 years with the Pilgrims. So we're at a very unique time that should remind us of prophecies And what Jesus said about this cornerstone and the nation that would bring forth fruit for God, but also the passages from where that initial conversation started too, because that's coming into play here, where we know the sun destruction is about to come onto the world, orchestrated by the children of darkness, who are the ones who also have made a covenant with death and hell. A lot coming together in prophecy. The more that we study prophecy, we know the time, the enemy knows the time. Of course, it all relates to the replanting of Israel, and particularly the Jewish people, of all people studying the Torah. They should have understood, and they would know exactly to the year that their captivity should have ended, particularly those of them who are the children of darkness, knowing when certain things were going to happen and when things were going to be allowed by God to happen as well. And so here in this modern time, this last generation has seen those initial events. There are people today who remember when those events happened. They remember some of the formative world events around that time too, and that led up to how Israel was formed. And we are now in a time that's known as the digital revolution, which started about 1947, moving from analog and mechanical to purely electronic, and computers, especially phones and all that. So we're in a digital revolution. It is amazing how much our world has changed just within the past 100 years. Of course, we know there's wars and rumors of wars. There's World War II, World War I, the War of Northern Aggression in America, also known as the Civil War, and then also around 1800 was the Napoleonic Wars. Very significant, with Napoleon really reshaped and changed the landscape there in Europe. And of course, as we've seen with order out of chaos, they like to use wars for those exact purposes, to create conditions, geopolitical conditions that change the makeup of countries, that change the governments, who is in power in them as well, allows them to change out different agents and all that. So when we look at wars, particularly the most significant wars in the past 200 years, we need to look at them as conditioning events. And as they are getting the chess pieces ready, understanding the time, they're developing their script to move the chess pieces into place so that everything is ready at certain prophetic times. All these wars are done deliberately, orchestrated deliberately, steered, and particularly in the outcomes and treaties and how world governments is handled after those wars. Because particularly with the Napoleonic Wars in World War I and World War II, that involved multiple nations. So after the wars, you have the conditions of how do they deal with the aftermath of that war, the political dealings, the treaties, how land is divvied up. There's a lot of restructuring and a lot of chess pieces involved after these wars. And that is the purpose of the wars. A lot of times the war is not the outcome itself, the desired outcome. It's what comes after that. What is it forced change going to be? And particularly with the Napoleonic Wars, that changed the Holy Roman Empire, allowed that change into the German Confederation from about 1815 to 1866. A loose confederation of German states. But then the Second Reich, the Second Empire, was formed when a lot of them started to come together with the German Empire from 1871 to 1918, the end of World War I. And so you can imagine that World War I was going to change some of that, and that led into the German Republic. It was no longer an empire, it's now a republic, also known as a Weimar Republic. That went from about 1918 to 1933. And so now we're within the lifespan of people who are still alive today, have seen these particular changes in that part of the world. And then the German Republic went into the Nazi Germany, the Third Empire, the Third Reich, 1933 to 1945. Again, keeping in mind our previous Bible studies on Daniel and the statue and the progression of nations, we see the importance of the Roman Empire, which transferred into the Holy Roman Empire and the dealings with the Vatican as well. And then that ultimately resulted in Nazi Germany, the Third Reich. And so that's an offshoot of a part of prophecy where we know the seventh king is going to come from that final kingdom in the latter days. And so it is important to understand this in light of prophecy. What happened in Germany wasn't just some random event that happened in world history. When we understand Daniel's prophecy, when we understand history and how prophecy was fulfilled, we see where Nazi Germany fits in. The result of what had been building in that area to that point, the preparation of certain individuals to that point, agents and handlers, and the conditions that were created that were going to result in events that would follow that, primarily with Israel. All this goes together, and this is tied to prophecy, and Jesus Christ even told us, you will see wars and rumors of wars and all these other events. It is important. It is the beginning of sorrows. You will see it, which means you need to pay attention to it because it is related to what is coming later. When we zoom in around the Napoleonic Wars over in Europe, over in America, that is when Noah Webster published his American Dictionary of the English Language, 1828. Also a speller and grammar, elementary reading books. Very profound influence on America, but also the English language. But then this was also the time of the Industrial Revolution. A lot of changes going on in the world. Right at the same time that over in Europe, Napoleon is going around involved in different wars and changing up the makeup there. But the Industrial Revolution saw the invention and the influence of the steam engines and the first textile mills. And the Industrial Revolution really sped up so much because some of the first industrial mills dealt with textiles. And then steam engines and other mills with food and other factories producing equipment as well. It also resulted in the standardization of gears and screws and a lot of machine parts so they can be interoperable and people could design different equipment. The standardization of a lot of this industrial equipment. And the initial trains, steam engine trains, major changes were happening really quickly. Again, up until this point, everything was handmade. Everything in the world was handmade. Not until this time were machines starting to mass produce things. In 1800, that is when Volta invented the voltaic pile, providing a continuous current of electricity for experimentation. So the first real battery was around 1800. They've been playing with electricity with other means to generate static electricity and smaller currents with other primitive batteries, but it's this voltaic pile that really was a major stepping stone for electricity, electrical experiments as we know them. A major change in the world, this invention of the battery, a consistent, steady source of electricity. So now the scientists could really start playing with how can we use electricity. There's nothing electrical in the world whatsoever. But now they got a battery so they can start experimenting more and more. How do we apply this? In 1840, that was the invention of the telegraph, a real commercial, usable telegraph. There were some primitive ones in that area too. But 1840 is when they started to see, hey, this is how we can use electricity for practical purposes, primarily for communication. 1855 was when Darwin published his On the Origin of Species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life by Charles Darwin. And most people are not familiar with the full title of it. They just hear On the Origin of Species. And it's a shortened title, but the full title reveals Darwin's perspective and intent. It is all about what he sees as favored races. And so this book, primarily with that title, threw a lot of gasoline on racial tensions already present in the world. And that was right before the American Civil War, but also 1861, right before the Civil War. That is when the American Overland Telegraph connected the west coast of the continent to the east coast, bringing an end to the Pony Express. So between 1840, the invention of the telegraph, and that point, the networks of telegraphs, primarily in America, had been spreading, but that is when they finally connected coast to coast. And you didn't have to send necessarily a message by Pony Express to reach the other coast. You could just now have it telegraphed. So rapid expansion now with suitable batteries, telegraphs, electricity is starting to be used in the world. But again, by the American Civil War, there's nothing else electrical in the world. Nothing else. But in 1859, that is when the Carrington event happened. Some of you may have heard about that, especially if you studied anything regarding EMP. That is when there was a solar storm, supposedly, that saturated the atmosphere with electrical currents, and that affected primarily the telegraph. Caused a lot of sparks. They were actually able to disconnect the batteries and still operate the telegraphs because the atmosphere was saturated with energy. So very fascinating to see that major event, and we haven't seen a saturation or EMP type event on that scale since then. So it's really interesting that happened at that point in time, and Lord willing, in a follow-up video, we may talk more about that. But just take note when it happened and what was going on in the world at that point. In our previous video, we talked about several inventors, Nikola Tesla, Albert Einstein, and John George Trump. But also during this time was Thomas Edison. Now, of course, they had nothing to do with the Carrington event because Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla, they were both kids at that time, so they didn't have anything to do with it. But both of those inventors crossed paths, and both of them brought about very significant inventions. In 1874, that's when Edison invented the quadruplex telegraph, and that enabled them to send multiple messages at the same time across one telegraph wire. Definitely sped things up. 1879, Edison's patent for the electric light bulb. And he didn't invent the first light bulb, but he's the first one who made it practical because at the same time he was also rolling out the infrastructure for it. 1880, he founded the Edison Illuminating Company, and during the 1880s, he patented a system for electricity distribution. And that's what really made his light bulb and system so popular, is he rolled out the whole system for it. The light bulbs, the wiring, the generator systems, the generator plants. He rolled out the whole system. And so that's why it latched on. Now for Tesla in 1882, pretty much almost the same time, that is when in the Vero-Saglet City Park, Tesla was looking at the setting sun and began to recite a passage from Goethe's Faust. And at that very moment, the idea came to him in a flash, and he drew a diagram of the AC motor in the sand with a stick. So a very important invention and major part of our life nowadays, the electric motor, the AC motor, came to him in a vision. And he's the first one to tell you that. 1884, Tesla briefly worked at the Edison Machine Works. Then in 1888, the polyphase AC, his alternating current AC induction motor, and related polyphase AC patents were licensed to Westinghouse Electric. So a lot happened in this window. The AC motor, electric motor, the light bulbs, electrical lines, generator plants started being rolled out in America and other places. A lot was happening really quickly with technology. 1877, the Bell Telephone Company was created, so now people could verbally talk. And these inventions in the next leap really marked the start of the second industrial revolution, which was marked by the light bulb and the electric motor, but primarily about the Bessemer steel-making process. It really allowed them to start churning out high-quality steel a whole lot faster, which of course drives further industry, on top of all the engines that have already been developed. Between now and World War I, this is when the Wright brothers started their flights. More plane development happened. The Titanic sank. Ford developed his assembly line cars. But keep in mind, during this time, up through World War I, during it, and even sometime beyond that, most people's transportation was by horse and carriage. So a lot is changing in the world right now. Between World War I and World War II, that's when aviation really started to get a hold, and commercial aviation with passenger transports, those rolled out in the 30s as well too. Lindenberg's flight was not too long after World War I ended. And then the next major invention of the atomic age with the nuclear test in 1945. So in about 100 years, the world went from having nothing electrical whatsoever to nuclear atomic bombs, World War I tanks and planes. So much has happened really quickly because of the technology, with just a handful of inventors really churning out some of the major world-changing technologies. And again, when we consider some of the people who are still alive today, the small handful of people, some of them born about the same time that Ford was making his assembly cars, there's a lot of people who have seen the world make major changes. They've seen how the geopolitical structure of countries, entire countries, and the makeup of Europe has been changed. They've seen the lifestyle changed, electricity rolled out. There's so much that this generation has still seen. They've seen how the world has changed. They've also seen the events that have really orchestrated a lot of the geopolitical changes. And again, when we understand the generation that is alive today, seeing the prophetic events, the 10 kings are part in that last generation. They are alive. They are part of seeing all that. They are alive now. But that also tells us they are continuing a work that has been scripted up until that point by their forebearers, by their forefathers. There are others who've been passing on a larger work by the children of darkness, orchestrated by those at the very top, who are not flesh and blood, the fallen angels and demonic entities, steering this whole script, who know the script, who know the time, who know when certain things will happen. So we're going to see prophecy fulfilled out longer than just one generation or two or even three. We're going to see it involve multiple generations of the children of darkness that are being orchestrated and moved like pawns by the demonic forces, knowing the script. So let's back up to the 1700s again. In 1754, that's the French looms, the Martinis. In 1755, there's the Frankists based on the Sohara. In 1760, another group as well. In the 1700s, there's a great congealing and coming together of these different occult groups, really starting to get organized more and more. And this is also when you're starting to see power being flexed because there's starting to be more organization. You've heard of the Rothschild family, a wealthy Ashkenazi Jewish family originally from Frankfurt, Germany, that rose to prominence with Mayer Rothschild, a court factor to the German and Free City of Frankfurt, Holy Roman Empire, who established its banking business in the 1760s. The family was elevated to noble rank in the Holy Roman Empire. During the 19th century, the Rothschild family possessed the largest private fortune in the world, as well as in modern world history. So very influential. This is well known by historians and those particularly in the financial realm who know the power of the Rothschilds. The largest private fortune in the world, richer than kings even. Nathan Mayer Rothschild started his business in Manchester in 1806 and gradually moved it to London, where in 1809 he acquired the location in the City of London, and that's the name of a district within the metropolitan area that most people know as London. There's a place within that actually called the City of London. That's the financial center where it operates today. They're still operating today. He gained a position of such power in the City of London that by 1825-26 he was able to supply enough coin to the Bank of England to enable it to avert a market liquidity crisis. So you know you're rich when you can bail out a national bank, the Bank of England. And if you ever go to the Wikipedia page about the Rothschilds, you'll notice they have many, many pictures of all the palaces that they had. They had scores of palaces throughout Europe. They were that rich. Everybody knew they were richer than royalty in England. Way beyond the riches of royalty. They were incredibly wealthy, filthy rich. Everybody knew how powerful they were, particularly because they had the ability to bail out national banks. Mayer Rothschild was a German Jewish banker and founder of the Rothschild banking dynasty, referred to as a founding father of international finance. Rothschild was ranked 7th on the Forbes magazine list of the 20 most influential businessmen of all time in 2005. His name is derived from the German meaning with the red shield, in reference to the house where the family lived for many generations. At the time, houses were designated by signs with different symbols or colors, not numbers. The name Rothschild in Yiddish means red coat in reference to the heraldic coat of arms. And that's what his name literally means, red shield, Rothschild. 1811, a number of Masonic Jews at the time also petitioned the Grand Duke for the exclusive right to maintain lodges in the city, which was granted, same place where he lived, and they just throw this detail in on his bio, conveniently letting you know that yes, he was also a Masonic Jew too. Nathan Mayer Rothschild, his son, born in Frankfurt, Germany, he was the third of the 5 sons of Gutel and Mayer Rothschild and was of the second generation of the Rothschild banking dynasty. Rothschild also had 5 sisters, including Henrietta Rothschild, who married Abraham Montefiore. Rothschild became a Freemason of the Emulation Lodge of the Premier Grand Lodge of England, 1802, London. The Rothschild loans to the Holy See. The first loan, which occurred in 1832, took place in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars during the pontificate of Pope Gregory XVI, involving James Rothschild and Karl Rothschild. This loan agreed on was for a sum of £400,000, equivalent to $4 billion in 2021. A second loan occurred during the pontificate of Pope Pius IX in the early 1850s with the same members of the Rothschild family. So this is significant numbers, $4 billion that they're loaning to the Vatican, bailing them out. And then they did another loan later on. James Rothschild, head of the Rothschild banking family in France, and they spread out throughout Europe, became the official papal banker. His Naples-based brother, Karl Rothschild, geographically closer to Rome, went to meet with Pope Gregory XVI in January 1832. Here, Karl Mayer was presented with the ribbon and star of the Sacred Military Constantine Order of St. George. It was customary for Catholics to show reverence for what they regarded as the Vicar of Christ to kiss the Pope's feet when meeting him. As a Jew, Karl Rothschild was permitted to simply kiss the ring on his hand instead. This outraged Catholic critics of the deal at the time. Reports of the transaction led to stinging criticisms of Pope Gregory and the Christian and particularly Catholic world. And again, this shows some of the power and influence of the Rothschilds, that they had a special, almost first-name basis with the Pope. They could kiss his hand. Nobody else could kiss his hand. And again, that just shows the power that they had. They could bail out banks, the Bank of England. They could make loans to the Vatican. Very large loans. They had a lot of power and influence because they controlled the purse strings. And because of those roles, he became the papal banker. Sir Moses Montefiore was a British financier and banker, activist, philanthropist, and sheriff of London. Born to an Italian Sephardic Jewish family based in London, after he achieved success, he donated large sums of money to promote industry, business, economic development, education, and health among the Jewish community in the Levant. So what we know as the Land of Israel area. He founded the first settlement outside the old city of Jerusalem in 1860, around the time of the U.S. Civil War. As president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, he corresponded with Charles Churchill, the British consul in Damascus in 1841-42. His contributions are seen as pivotal to the development of Proto-Zionism, the first initial steps of possibly returning to the land for the Jews. In 1812, Montefiore became a Freemason, joining the Moray Lodge of the premier Grand Lodge of England in London. In 1812, Moses Montefiore married Judith Cohen, daughter of Levi Cohen. Her sister, Henrietta, married Nathan Rothschild, for whom Montefiore's firm acted as stockbrokers. Nathan Rothschild headed the family banking business in Britain, and the two brothers-in-law became business partners. So you have two families who are very powerful and influential, very wealthy, intermarrying, and also working together as business partners. So a lot of power, very closely kept together among these families. Rothschild banking family of Austria, and of course Austria is going to play a part in some of the geopolitical events, was founded by banker Salman Rothschild in 1820 in Vienna, very important, remember that, Vienna, a very important place, in what was then the Austrian Empire. The rise of Nazi Germany in the 1930s led to a precarious situation for the Austrian Rothschilds under the annexation of Austria in 1937, when the family was pressured to sell its banking operation at a fraction of its real worth. While other Rothschilds had escaped the Nazis, Louis Rothschild was imprisoned for a year and only released after a substantial ransom was paid by his family, reportedly the largest ransom that has ever been paid in history. After Louis was allowed to leave the country in March 1939, the Nazis placed the firm of Rothschild under compulsory administration. Nazi officers and senior staff from Austrian museums also emptied the Rothschild family estates of all their valuables. Following the war, the Austrian Rothschilds were unable to reclaim much of their former assets and properties. So a large wealth transfer from the Rothschilds to the Nazis happened with this incident here. So the Rothschilds were in France, Britain, Austria, Germany, multiple places, really spreading out their influence. 1791, Rothschild set up First Bank of the United States with a 20-year charter. 1798, Mayer sent his son Nathan to London to set up a major bank there, exercise his influence there. 1812, Mayer sent son Jacob to Paris. 1813, 1815, Nathan almost single-handedly financed the British Crown and its continental allies in the Napoleonic Wars. So again, showing the power and influence that they're quickly grabbing hold in these various locations. 1815, Nathan knew England had won the Battle of Waterloo. He got heads-up early information, intel, which allowed him to multiply his wealth with strategic buys. There's some debate on exactly what transpired with that, but he definitely used that information to his advantage. And when you consider the money that he had, he was able to make a large change in his fortune because of this intel. 1825, Nathan bailed out the Bank of England. 1832, Nathan loans money to the Vatican. 1839, 1842, that was the Opium War back in England. A very tragic event of the introduction in China of opium, really using it to manipulate geopolitical events, but it really shows you the power. With the right influence, you can really change geopolitical situations. And that's what happened. It really drained a lot of wealth out of China. 1838, House of Morgan, founded in America by George Peabody, business associate of the Rothschilds. J.P. Morgan was essentially the American wing of the Rothschilds. 1850, Nathan loans to the Vatican again. And by the 1860s, the wealth of the world is basically in their hands. It was well recognized. By 1860s, the Rothschilds, everybody knew they were the financial power. They loaned to the Vatican. They bailed out national banks. They had multiple palaces all over the place. They were richer than royalty. And they weren't just rich. They had power and influence. They could change outcomes of wars. So again, when we zoom out, it is incredible how much just within 100 years of that period, the Rothschilds came to power and already changed multiple geopolitical events in the area. But you're also seeing a convergence of different occult groups as well too, particularly now that some of the major players in it are also in those occult groups. You're going to see them using that power, that money, and the influence to get even tighter and use it for their purposes, for the children of darkness purposes. 1894, Nathan's son-in-law, the Earl of Rosebery, became British Prime Minister. So now you got them in your pocket too. So power is not just by money, it's by connection. And being based in the city of London itself, the financial center, they have so many people in their pocket. During the Panic of 1893, U.S. President Grover Cleveland accepted Morgan's offer to join with the Rothschilds and supplied the U.S. Treasury with 3.5 million ounces of gold to restore the Treasury surplus in exchange for a 30-year bond issue. The U.S. Treasury, 1907, J.P. Morgan and Partners generated a bank run, deliberately, on the overextended U.S. private banks. Morgan offered to bring liquidity back to the market through issuance of his own currency. He reestablished confidence in credit markets, heralded as a national hero by then Princeton University President Woodrow Wilson. Really lauded, J.P. Morgan's, he was the perfect solution for this crisis. Of course, they didn't mention that, he generated and they had power to influence and cause the bank run. And because Woodrow Wilson gave them kudos, 1913, Woodrow Wilson, then U.S. President, signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. High treason. It's neither federal, neither is there a reserve. 1914, the beginning of World War I, the German Rothschilds were funding the German side, the British Rothschilds were funding the British side, and the French Rothschilds were funding the French side. You play all sides. You have agents on all sides. The thesis, antithesis, so that you can guide and steer the outcome, the synthesis. 1917, Germany offered armistice to Britain. Rothschild agents promised Britain to bring America into the war on the side of the British, providing the British agreed to give the land of Palestine to the Rothschilds. And that was the subject and timing of the Balfour Declaration. So World War I is very important because they're starting to exert power and influence to start bringing about the events that are going to relate to when Israel ends their time of captivity. So these are prophetic events, which also shows the children of darkness are aware of this. And they know in 1948 the land will be allowed to return to Israel. God will allow that. They know, they are aware that God is in control of that. So it will be allowed then. So now they're starting to set up the geopolitical situation with their chess pieces to work toward that so that they are in control. They want their hand on the steering wheel. And so they're exerting working events relating to World War I, which is also going to change the geopolitical situation that will result in the freeing of the land of Palestine. Also putting heavy pressure and influence, even bringing in America into the situation to make sure it happens, to make sure the war ends with a certain condition and a certain result, freeing up this land. So there's a lot of conditions, major power plays being happened to force a condition. To force a condition. That's what wars are for, to force a condition, create conditions. 1905, that was the Russian Revolution, often considered the great dress rehearsal, which would soon come not too long after that. 1913, Jacob Schiff, who's a close family bonds with the Rothschilds, he funded the Russian revolutionaries with $20 million to overthrow the Tsar of Russia, which happened 4 years later, 1917, the Bolshevik takeover. And this is also important as the enemy knew that the timing is coming close to when Israel will return. They're going to have to ruffle the feathers. They're going to have to start defeathering the nest, start getting the Jewish people moving who are comfortable in Europe and Russia and America, start getting them to want to move to the land of Palestine. So a lot of these revolutions in Russia, what you're seeing is when they happen, there's a lot of programs and persecution of the Jews, which starts to make them realize we need to move somewhere else, somewhere safer. So the Bolshevik takeover and the revolution started a lot of immigrants moving to America, but it also was starting to stir the pot of the Jews really need their own place. Even the Jewish people, we need our own safe place. So we're safe from all these other revolutions and just the willy-nillys of these other countries, whatever decisions they make. So the children of darkness who are being used by God as his pawns, they are ruffling the feathers and getting the people in motion to move. Other events stand out during this historical time and change, 1878 to 1886. That is when the Pergamon altar was excavated by German engineer Karl Humann. Relief panels were sent to Berlin in 1879. So they were doing the excavations and starting to send the pieces to Berlin. And of course, the Pergamon altar is literally the seat of Satan, the altar of Satan, described in the book of Revelation, and which we covered in our videos related to the Antichrist playlist. Definitely check that out. The seat of Satan was being unearthed and excavated during this time, during these lead-up events that are going to deal with the freeing of the land of Israel. These are not by accident. These are not coincidental. Neither is it coincidental where these remains and these excavations are being sent to. They're being sent to Berlin, Germany. A few years later in Berlin, they constructed a temporary Pergamon altar museum, told it until they could build a more permanent, larger museum, which was constructed between 1910 and 1930, the Pergamon Museum that we know today. The construction was halted during the war, and also during the period of hyperinflation that followed the war too, and it was finished in 1930. A very, very important time in Germany when a certain individual was coming to power right at that exact same time when the altar of Satan was excavated and coming to full public demonstration. Of course, in 1936, the Berlin Olympics. The Olympic Committee was given a banquet in their honor in front of the Pergamon altar at the museum. Right here, of course, during Nazi Germany, with this occult influence when a certain individual has suddenly come onto the scene, right at a time when Satan's altar is now prominent on the world scene, right front and center, while this individual is also capturing the world's attention with what is going on here. This is not by coincidence whatsoever. All during this time while the children of darkness are orchestrating the start of the World War I, knowing the conditions that it would create in the war, what would happen after the war, what would happen just a few years after the war too with the replanting of Israel. Everything in this time frame, while the altar of Satan is coming to public light, public attention, coming to the forefront, being literally unearthed right at a time with a prophetic individual, the seventh king, right as he uses the altar of Satan as his stage. The Rothschild influence continued after World War II. They really started going more secretive and divesting their power through other shell companies to hide the ownership. So it appears that they've lessened their power, but it's really strengthened, especially when you look at the number of corporations and shell companies and everything. They still have the same amount of power and wealth, and it's actually increased. When we look at the 2012 London Olympics, that was highly Masonic, highly occult. Everyone looking at the opening ceremony knew that was very dark. That was definitely done deliberately. And you will remember in our video, the 2012 clock snare, that is when the enemy in the opening ceremony even rehearsed stopping time relating to money as well. They also show the bottomless pit opening and the beast coming up out of the bottomless pit with the demons. Remember that? It's not by coincidence that that is done in London, the financial power center of the world, with the city of London just not that far away from where these Olympics were held, which again is not coincidence at all. The more that we look at history and different events with the children of darkness, how they've been organizing, we can see in the late 1700s, early 1800s, that is really when they were converging together, their powers, their influences, all bringing it together, really getting a power base, and by working together tighter and a lot of overlaps between different societies, they were able to share so much, they were able to increase their power to where they became a dominant power broker that could influence deliberately for their purposes, for the purposes of the children of darkness. Using the influence started back with the Templars, the early bankers, the power through the Vatican, that's where it's channeled through. That's one of the major handlers and steerers of it all, but also bringing more power, influence, and merging together different power players, bringing it together to increase their power. This really happened during this time. You're bringing together the occult teaching groups, people who are on the same mind, which is what Revelation tells us, some who are powerful and wealthy, using their power and influence. These different groups have intelligence gathering. They have influence because they work in very tight circles. They know what's going on in multiple places. Again, through the Freemasons, they have lodges all over the place. It acts as an intelligence agency for them. They get a lot of inside information, insider trading as well. They have an edge on monopolies as well and manipulation of the financial system because they have insiders and this intelligence network that's operating secretly. which gives them advantage in their financial dealings, which gives them even more power. And they use their own spy networks of the geopolitical situations and in government for further insider training, and they also manipulate, have people in their pocket for their purposes as well. You're really seeing emerging and a building of a power base. Now they really have power for a common goal. They are really getting of one mind around this time and starting to exercise power of that mind for a script, moving in a certain direction to time things with a time that they know will happen on the prophetic clock and with a very specific last generation. They can start scripting all this out in the late 1700s. Already knowing the direction that they wanted to move, and start using the money and the power and influence for that and toward that. Even manipulating the world events in the early 1800s and, of course, in America as well, because they're converging their power base, getting it tighter and tighter, knowing the script, getting together of one mind for the purpose of one day, ultimately, according to the script, handing their power and authority to the beast who was there. He will be here for a while. They will work with him, but then he will go away. He will disappear completely, and they will still work geopolitical events. So when he comes back onto the scene at the end of the last generation, they will then fully give it onto his hand, and they will rule and reign with him for a short time too. It's all scripted because they do know what Scripture says, and they know the prophetic clock that is ticking down. And so as you start to see the children of darkness who are in the Freemasons and in these groups, very publicly, secular known that they are in there, when they start using that power and that influence, they can start using it for their goal, which relates to the events that are going to happen in the land of Palestine. And so that's why you start to see them funding the Jewish interests. It's not necessarily because of the generosity of their heart. They have a darker long-term view. In the 1840s and 1850s, the early Jewish settlements beyond Old Jerusalem, funded by Sir Haim Montefiore, this was seen as the pivotal to the development of Proto-Zionism. In the 1840s, before even the American Civil War, starting the ball rolling. 1885 and 1891, an early version of the Israeli flag. 1895, Edmund Rothschild visits Palestine. He funds Jewish colonies there too. And so, again, they're starting to get the ball rolling. They're starting to invest money. There's going to be some geopolitical situations that still have to change because the area is still under control of the Ottoman Empire. So they're going to have to change that, and they will change that. And at this time, the land of Israel is a large wasteland. There's not much there. Mark Twain talked about that. He went over there. There's no reason for people to move there. And so the Jewish people are going to have to be forced to move there, which means you're going to have to create conditions elsewhere where they are already comfortable. You're going to have to make them uncomfortable in order for them to move to the land of Israel. Because you're going to have to need a large amount of Jews there in order to enact political nationalism there too for later events that you want to manipulate too. So you're going to need to gather a bunch of Jews together. How do you get them to move there? You make them uncomfortable where they are. Order out of chaos. 1897, the Rothschilds found the Zionist Congress, chaired by Theodore Herzl, adopts Rothschild's star on its flag. So the flag reflects the symbol of the children of darkness who've been funding and who want this to happen for their end goals. They're using the Jewish people as their own pawns for their own end goals. They don't really care about them. They're going to turn on them later anyway during the tribulation. The Bible tells us that. They are preparing things for the one they want to give power to, who they know is in open rebellion to Jesus Christ and God, and who will blaspheme God to his face, blaspheme the temple. They don't care about the Jewish interests, the Jewish culture. They really don't. They're just using them. They're just using them. But because of their money and influence, that is why their symbol is on the flag, because of the people who have really been bankrolling a lot of the initial events and really getting the ball rolling. And also creating conditions to where Jews will really want to move to a new place. Which again brings us back to the Pergamon altar being unveiled at this time, the seed of Satan being excavated, brought to public light, right at a time when a certain individual is coming onto the world scene who would go down in history as very important to the Jewish people, their interests, but also the primary driving cause of why so many Jews would want to move to the land of Israel. Their own safe place all of a sudden. What happened in Germany during World War II was not to win a war for Germany. It was to change world conditions. It was part of the script to lose the war, because that was not the end goal. They didn't want to build a power base then. It served its purposes to get other things going in the world, to create other conditions, order out of chaos. They had to create a lot of chaos. And that changed so many things on the entire world, particularly in Europe and in the Middle East. All revolving around a very peculiar individual with a fierce countenance, Adolf Hitler. The one who came into the public limelight at the exact same time as the altar of Satan, the seat of Satan. Thank you for joining us on our stay today. Stay tuned for part 4, where we're going to go further in this study. And until next time, Maranatha.